Seven Fallen Feathers: Racism, Death, and Hard Truths in a Northern City by Tanya Talaga. This is a House of Anansi Press audiobook, narrated by Michaela Washburn. For the next generation, Natasha and William. For strong mothers, Sheila and Margaret. And for Jethro, Kieran, Robin, Paul, Reggie, Kyle, and Jordan. The Anishinaabe are guided by 7 principles. Zagedwin, love. To know love is to know peace. Manajuin, respect. To honor all of creation is to have respect. Akdehewin, bravery. To face life with courage is to know bravery. Goyakwadsewin, honesty. To walk through life with integrity is to know honesty. The Maademzewin, humility. To accept yourself as a sacred part of creation is to know humility. Wakawin, wisdom. To cherish knowledge is to know wisdom. Debwewin, truth. To know of these things is to know the truth. Bakanake nagi iji gakenu amagumin. We were taught differently. The Indian Residential School Experience. Cultural genocide is the destruction of those structures and practices that allow the group to continue as a group. States that engage in cultural genocide set out to destroy the political and social institutions of the targeted group. Land is seized, and populations are forcibly transferred and their movement is restricted. Languages are banned, spiritual leaders are persecuted, spiritual practices are forbidden, and objects of spiritual value are confiscated and destroyed. And, most significantly to the issue at hand, families are disrupted to prevent the transmission of cultural values and identity from one generation to the next. In its dealing with Aboriginal people, Canada did all these things. Honoring the truth, reconciling for the future. Summary of the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. Prologue. 1. Notes from a Blind Man. Arthur Street runs east to west in a long, straight ribbon through the downtown area of the Fort William region of Thunder Bay. Arthur Street is devoid of charm. It's a stretch of drive-through restaurants, gas bars and grocery stores, and cars in a hurry to get anywhere but here. Turn off Arthur north onto Syndicate, and you'll find the Victoriaville Centre, a poorly planned shopping mall with a 1970s vibe. The mall is riddled with empty stores and stragglers having a cup of coffee before heading over to the courthouse across the street. Parts of the mall have been taken over by mental health clinics, an art gallery, and an Indigenous health center. Upstairs is the main administration office of Anishinaabe Aski Nation, NAN, a political organization representing 49 First Nation communities encompassing 2/3 of the province of Ontario, spanning 543,897.5 square kilometers. There is one elevator, and it behaves like an old man. It grumbles as the door shuts, and it shakes and heaves its way slowly upstairs. A sign posted near the button says, "When the elevator breaks down, call this number." When, not if. This was where I found myself one gray day in April 2011. I was there to see Stan Beardy, NAN's Grand Chief. The 2011 federal election was in full swing. The incumbent Conservative candidate, Prime Minister Stephen Harper, was largely loathed by the Indigenous community. During his 5 years as Prime Minister, he had stripped away environmental protections, built pipelines, and continually underfunded the 634 First Nations across Canada. Harper was duking it out with Jack Layton, a former Toronto City Councillor and leader of the left-leaning New Democratic Party. Leighton was a guitar-playing socialist whose mandate was to tear down highways and build bike lanes and parks. The receptionist ushered me into a large common meeting room to wait for Stan. Everything in the room was gray. The walls, the tubular plastic tables, the carpets. The only splash of color was a white flag with a red oval in the middle. Inside the oval, a traditional symbol of life for Indigenous people, is the great white bear. The red background is symbolic of the red man. The bear is stretched out, arms and legs open wide. His feet are planted firmly on a line, which represents the earth, while his head touches another line, which is symbolic of his relationship to the Great Spirit in the sky. The circles forming the bear's ribcage are the communities, and the lines of the ribcage are Indigenous songs and legends, cultures and traditions that bind all the clans together. Stan walked in and greeted me warmly. His brown eyes twinkled as he took a seat. Stan is a quiet, pensive man. He said nothing as he wearily leaned back in his chair and waited for me to explain why exactly I had flown 920 kilometers north from Toronto to talk about the federal election. I launched into an explanation of what I was writing about, trying not to sound like an interloper into his world, someone who kind of belongs here and kind of doesn't. This is the curse of my mixed blood. I'm the daughter of an Eastern European, an Ojibwe mother who was raised in the bush about 1 hour's drive west of Thunder Bay, and a Polish father from Winnipeg. I rattled off abysmal voting pattern statistics among First Nations across Canada, while pointing out that in many ridings, Indigenous people could act as a swing vote, hence influencing the trajectory of the election. Stan stared at me impassively. I started firing off some questions, but every time I tried to engage him, he talked about the disappearance of a 15-year-old Indigenous boy named Jordan Wabass. It was a frustrating exchange. We were speaking two different languages. Indigenous voters could influence 50 seats across the country if they got out and voted, but they don't, I said. Why? Why aren't you writing a story on Jordan Wabass? Stan replied. Stephen Harper has been no friend to Indigenous people, and if everyone voted, they could swing the course of this election, I countered. Jordan has been gone for 71 days now, he said. I tried to ask about Leighton. Surely the policies of the left-leaning New Democratic Party would be more focused on Indigenous issues, I pressed. But to this, Stan said, they found a shoe down by the water. Police think it might have been Jordan's. This standoff went on for a good 15 minutes before I gave up and we sat in silence. I was annoyed. I knew a missing grade 9 Indigenous student in Thunder Bay would not make news in urban Toronto. Then I remembered my manners and where I was. I was sitting with the elected Grand Chief of 45,000 people, and he was clearly trying to tell me something. Jordan is the 7th student to go missing or die while at school, Stan said. Since 2000, Jethro Anderson, Kieran Strang, Paul Panachis, Robin Harper, Reggie Bushy, and Kyle Morriso had died. Now Jordan Wabass was missing. Stan's message finally sank in. 7 students. 7 is a highly symbolic number in Indigenous culture. Every Anishinaabe person knows the prophecy of the 7 fires. Each prophecy was referred to as a fire. Each fire represents a key time in the history of the people on Turtle Island, the continent of North America. The first 3 fires outline the story of what life was like before first contact with Europeans in 1492, of the peaceful existence along the Atlantic coast and the migration west to find food and water. The 4th fire predicts the coming of the light-skinned race and what happens once they arrive. This prophecy warned that the Anishinaabe would be able to tell the future by reading the faces of the light-skinned race. There were 2 predictions based on this reading. In this first, if the face was one of happiness and brotherhood, a time of change would come for everyone on Turtle Island. 2 nations would join as one, resulting in the growth of a mighty nation full of knowledge and understanding. This would be a time of harmony and peace. But the second prediction said that if the light-skinned race wore a face of darkness, the Anishinaabe must be very careful. This face would bring extreme suffering and death. This face might be hard to see in the beginning. It might resemble the first face, but in fact, behind the second face, the hearts of the light-skinned race are dark and want nothing more than to take for themselves what the land has to offer. This face would bring forth destruction, filling the rivers and waters with poisons and causing the animals to begin to die. By the fifth fire, war and suffering would grip the people. There would be promises of salvation by one who would assure them that there would be joy if the indigenous people accepted his teachings. But if the people listened to this prophet, they would be lost for generations. They would forget the ways of the past and have no direction for the future. By the sixth fire, the light-skinned face would wear the mask of death. The people would have been deceived. Sickness of the spirit and body would overwhelm the people, and the children would be taken away. The teachings of the elders in the past would be forgotten, and families would be torn apart and stripped bare. The people would be gutted, their purpose in life forgotten, and the cup of life will almost become the cup of grief. By the time of the seventh fire, young people would rise up and begin to follow the trails of the past, seeking help from the elders, but many of the elders would have fallen asleep or be otherwise unable to help. The young would have to find their own way, and if they were successful, there would be a rebirth of the Anishinaabe nation. But if they were to fail, all would fail. Stan told me the 7 students were from communities and families hundreds of kilometers away in the remote regions of northern Ontario, where there are very few high schools. All of them were forced to leave their reserves to pursue their education. More than 75 northern First Nation communities from Nan Territory and from Grand Council Treaty No. 3 near the Manitoba border are isolated reservations spread across a vast area of forests full of birch trees, sweet-smelling cedars, and the rock of the Canadian Shield. Indigenous people moved to Thunder Bay out of necessity to complete their high school education, to find a job, to access health care, and to escape the poverty of the res. About 108,000 people live in the city, and according to Statistics Canada, more than 10,000 are Indigenous. But that number is only going up. Near 2030, 15% of the city of Thunder Bay's estimated population is expected to be Indigenous. The city couldn't be any more different from the communities they have left. Back home, there are no traffic lights or crosswalks, no McDonald's or Loblaws. Most communities have only one shop, the Northern Store, a catch-all selling everything from high-priced groceries to batteries and rubber boots. These goods are all flown in via charter airplane, making the prices prohibitive, often 3 or 4 times the price of food in southern cities. Food insecurity in the north isn't just about prices. Vegetables, fruit, and fresh meat are often so expensive that people rely on cheaper food items such as bread, pop, and processed meat to fuel their diet. Poverty forces these choices, and a host of food-related problems plague Indigenous people as a result. Diabetes, high blood pressure, heart disease, and dental problems are all consequences of diets high in carbohydrates and sugar. There is a strong push to return to traditional foods, such as moose, rabbit, fish, partridge, and goose, to reduce dependence on pricey, flown-in groceries, and to learn the ways of the ancestors. The communities are surrounded by the largest concentration of freshwater lakes in the world, but the First Nations often have no access to clean running water and sewage systems. If power goes down, water can't be filtered. Access to strong, sustainable power is a constant issue in the north. Many communities rely on carbon-spewing diesel generators to supply them with electricity. Lines can freeze in the winter. Nearly half of Ontario's Indigenous communities have a boil water advisory at any given time. People can't drink what comes out of the taps, and parents can't bathe their children in water that isn't laden with bacteria. Sometimes what water they do have is stolen by bigger southern cities. For nearly a century, the Manitoba city of Winnipeg has used an aqueduct to suck away water from the northwestern Ontario Indigenous community of Shoal Lake 40 to provide the city of nearly 700,000 people with drinking water. Meanwhile, the water left for the residents of Shoal Lake 40 is laced with bacteria, and a boil water advisory has been in place for nearly 20 years. The communities have virtually no hospitals. There is one in Moose Factory, no professional fire departments, and very few functional schools. Almost all of the schools located in fly-in reserves end at grade 8, with only a handful going to grade 12. If students want to go to high school, they have to move to an urban center such as Timmins, Sioux Lookout, or Thunder Bay. The last residential school in Canada was shut down in the 1990s. The federal government, through Indian and Northern Affairs Canada, INAC, was then supposed to fund and maintain schools for Indigenous children. But across Canada, this promise has never been properly fulfilled. The quality of teaching standards and equipment at reserve schools varies widely from coast to coast. Fundamentals that other school jurisdictions take for granted, such as libraries, gymnasiums, and science labs, are routinely absent. Going to high school is the right of every Canadian child, Stan said. But these children have been treated differently, their needs forgotten in a country that prides itself on having one of the best education systems in the world. He looked at me. Let me take you on a drive. We left the Nan office and climbed into his beat-up old pickup truck. He popped a CD of gospel music into the player. Listening to gospel music soothed Stan's soul. He felt closer to his son when he thought about God. Daniel Beardy was 19 years old when he was found beaten and unconscious at a house party on Fort William First Nation. He was just finishing up at Dennis Franklin Cromartie, DFC, High School in Thunder Bay, the school for Indigenous students run by the Northern Anishinaabe Education Council, ENIC. Most of the kids who attend Dennis Franklin come from reserves several hundred kilometers away from Thunder Bay. The students have to live in boarding houses, and the boarding parents are paid by the school to look after the kids. 6 of the 7 students in this book went to DFC. The Beardies are from Muskrat Dam First Nation, an isolated community of about 300 people deep in Ontario's north, accessible only by air. But because Stan, Daniel's father, was the Grand Chief, he had to move to Thunder Bay. His wife Nellie joined him, and so did Daniel, who lived with his parents while he was attending high school. Daniel was Stan and Nellie's only son, their pride and joy, a gregarious teen who loved life, his friends, and hockey. The Beardy's son fell in love with the game when he was 5 years old and later ranked second as a goalie in the Ontario Junior A League. The move to Thunder Bay meant he could play for more professional teams that were once home to NHL greats like the Stahl brothers, Patrick Sharp, and goalie Matt Murray. Daniel's NHL dream was beaten out of him on a late July night. After spending 30 hours in intensive care, he succumbed to his wounds on August 1st, 2004. Stan cannot let Daniel go. And he would not let the 7 go. When Stan talked about losing his son, the pain of the lost 7 was closely tied to him. The loss of Daniel and the loss of the 7 represented the loss of hope, the failure of one generation to take care of the next. Their disappearances and deaths signified everything wrong in the relationship between Canada and the Indigenous people. Stan was telling me that Jordan, the boy who was missing, was a goaltender like Daniel when he stopped the car. I looked around and saw the James Street swing bridge that crossed the Kaministiquia River. He parked near the shore, behind a couple of buildings that looked like they were abandoned. "What are we doing here?" I asked as I stepped out of the truck. A feeling of dread rose within me. Before us was the Cam's just thawing, rushing brown water. On the other side of its swollen spring banks loomed Animikiwaju, Ojibwe for Thunder Mountain, or what the colonials call Mount McKay, a tourist destination that offers a panoramic view of the city and of the sleeping Nanabojo. Animikiwaju, towering 300 meters over the city, is not just a scenic outlook. It is the spiritual center for the Ojibwe of Fort William First Nation. My heart beat fast. Sickness brewed in the pit of my stomach. I knew this place well. This was my grandmother's reserve, where my children have run through the long grass under the glare of the summer sun and have been chastised by patrolling res police officers for trying to climb the crumbling shale rocks on the side of the mountain. Stan nodded and then said, "We think Jordan was chased into the river." Searchers found one of his running shoes right here. Indigenous hunters, experts in tracking animals through the bush, found footprints leading up to the water. It looked like there had been a chase. The bodies of 4 boys had already been discovered in the waters and floodways that feed into Lake Superior. 1 month later, Jordan would be the 5th. These are the notes from a blind man. The blind man is an elder. He had a vision. So he told Lillian Seconaqueb. Lillian was in charge of the Webequie First Nation community search for Jordan Wabas, who went missing on February 7, 2011. She had set up a command center on the Fort William side of the city, in the old Canadian Red Cross office. When Jordan disappeared, members of the Webequie First Nation community traveled nearly 540 kilometers south to Thunder Bay to search for him. Dozens of them, young and old, relatives, friends, and strangers, because this is what you do when one of your own has gone missing. Some of the searchers were expert trackers, known for their prowess in the bush. They traveled the winter roads and came with their trucks and their snowmobiles. Among them was the blind man. Lillian talked to the blind man. She sat down with him at a table, and with a ballpoint pen she drew out his vision on 6 sheets of white paper. The drawing starts with a river, running in a squiggle down the center of the page. This river is the Cam. Beside the river there is a fence and 2 buildings, side by side, with a note that says they are about a foot apart. The elder says that he sees train tracks on the north side of the water. On the south side, he sees Mount McKay. He sees a bridge. The blind man sees the pulp mill. He sees buildings, grain elevators. He sees an industrial warehouse, storage. The place is not fenced. It is along the rail tracks. Lillian draws it all. He tells Lillian that 2 people met Jordan on the night he vanished. They are young like him. There is an altercation, a scuffle. "They are definitely trying to hide," says the blind man. The blind man sees the spirit of Jordan's body lying down on the ground. The snow is not very deep. Jordan's spirit sits either on top of the water or on the shore. The blind man sees Jordan's face. His face faces north. His feet face south. The blind man says the turtle spirit is near. So is the night bird. He says the bear travels at night. Then he says, the more you search, the more he vanishes. In September 2010, Jordan, Titus, Lawrence, Wabas flew down to Thunder Bay where he was enrolled in the Matawa Learning Center, a brand new school located in the 2-story brown building that houses the Matawa Tribal Council. The school has no green space or fields for athletics, no track or anything else that might give the appearance of a high school. It is a dated, low-rise office tower that faces a major thoroughfare and a parking lot. The Matawa Tribal Council represents 9 Cree and Ojibwe Northern First Nations, including Jordan's home of Webequie. The council chose the name because in both Ojibwe and Cree, Matawa means the meeting of the rivers. Matawa's 9 communities share a common geographical boundary in the north. They are all connected by major river systems. It is not uncommon for Indigenous tribal councils to come together and form an alliance to offer a variety of services for those from home who find themselves in the city. The councils can help with job training, housing, and even education. Matawa runs elementary schools in all 9 of its First Nations. The council is also keenly aware of and upfront about its failings. In their own 2007 educational report, they note that despite major improvements over the past 10 years, Matawa's education system remains subpar in comparison with those of other municipalities and falls below provincial standards. The system struggles with low student achievement and significant grade gaps against provincial standards. There is a lack of classroom facilities, teaching resources, and specialty teachers who can educate children with cognitive, physical, and special needs. Only 30 students were enrolled at the Matawa Learning Center. It offers an alternative education program where kids are given an individualized learning plan. Students aren't accepted at the school unless they prove they are responsible and able to handle the program. Jordan was both. Jordan had begged his mom, Bernice, to let him go to Thunder Bay to continue his education. He was a good student, strong in English and in math. Bernice was hesitant. She wanted her son to stay in Webequie and attend the local high school. She knew it wasn't the best school. The school was made up of portables and had limited choices in courses. But Thunder Bay was so far away and she wouldn't be able to go with him because she had to stay to take care of Jordan's younger siblings. Jordan had big dreams. He desperately wanted to play hockey in a real house league and eventually play for the Maple Leafs or another NHL team. He knew that would never happen if he stayed in Webequie. The community didn't even have an indoor arena. There was only an outdoor rink, which wasn't always maintained even in the winter, and there were not enough kids for a proper league. Bernice knew what she needed to do. Send her son to the city where he could get a high school education and play for a real league. Bernice had to let Jordan go. She couldn't stand in the way of him wanting to better himself. What mother could? It tore her up inside, but she had to smile, fill him with confidence, and ignore the dull ache of worry that gathered inside her. In Thunder Bay, Jordan would have to board with his distant cousin Clifford Wabass and his wife Jessica in their 2-story townhouse on a crescent near the airport in Fort William. Boarding parents were given $500 a student every month to cover living expenses such as the roof over their head, snacks, and dinner. The parents were under no obligation to supervise the kids at night, eat meals with them, help them with their homework, or take them to any after-school activities. Clifford's house was small, so Jordan shared a room with another student, Shane Troutlake. Clifford liked Jordan right off the bat. He was a quiet, polite kid who kept to himself. Jordan stood a strapping 6'1", and at 200 pounds he could easily be mistaken for a man. But he wasn't a man. He was a 15-year-old kid who had not yet grown into his adult body. To get to school, Jordan and Shane had to take public transit. A stop was just a short walk away on Mary Street. On Monday, February 7th, 2011, Clifford saw Jordan leave from Matawa at 8:20 a.m. as usual. It was cold that morning. Northern freeze-your-ears-off cold. The temperature fluctuating between minus 17 degrees Celsius during the day and minus 32 at night. Like most teenage boys, Jordan wasn't dressed for the weather. He wore white Adidas running shoes, a Maple Leafs baseball cap, a purple Hurley hoodie under a lined dark blue denim jacket, a white t-shirt that said "Blink if you want me," and black plastic wind pants. Jordan met his buddy Desmond Jacob, a fellow student from Webequie, on the bus that morning, and Shane saw Jordan in the hall at Matawa later that afternoon. At any given time, there were about a dozen kids from Webequie at the high school. For many, this was the first time they had ever been to a city, the first time they saw traffic lights or a shopping mall. Thunder Bay was nothing like home. Webequie is perched up high in the James Bay lowlands, accessible only by flight or by frozen winter ice